Well, good afternoon. Good afternoon. Welcome to our seventh and our final lecture on Columba, and this one is entitled His Influence and His Legacy. Again, just one or two issues of housekeeping before we start. To remind you, as we said last week, that the autumn series, the autumn semester, will be taken by Dr. Rob Schilliker, and he'll be talking about Calvin's Institutes of the Christian Religion. So that's for the autumn semester, so there will be notices about that in due course. And then also, I think everybody will have a copy of the outline of today's lecture on your seat. And again, also to remind everybody of the Highland Church History Conference at the end of August. And if you want to give an early expression of interest in that, then please fill in the form. There's forms on the table. Hand them in downstairs, and we'll make sure that you're kept in touch with that. And also just remind everybody about the donations to HTC as well. So today we come to the final lecture in our series on St. Columba. And in this lecture we'll attempt to do two things. First, we'll complete our reflections on Columba as politician and envoy. When we looked at this last week, we were only able to look at his relationship with King Aidan of Dalriata, who was the king of Dalriata for most of Columba's stay on Iona, for the majority number of years. Today we want to look at his relationship with another local king, King Bridei of Strathclyde, the Britons of Strathclyde, who was also a very powerful, a very important king during Columba's lifetime. So we'll complete our reflections on Columba as politician and envoy, and then second, we'll reflect on Columba's influence and his legacy. And we'll offer a few thoughts on that as well. So Columba and King Bridei of the Britons of Strathclyde. Just south of the city of Edinburgh are the Pentland Hills, and these hills form a long line of wonderful, gentle walking country. And the Pentlands, being in the heartland of Scotland, also carry many historical echoes. And one of these resonances has an oblique allusion to Columba. Very oblique, but we can make a connection. Close in to the southern flank of the Pentlands is the village of West Linton. But West Linton has an alternative name, not a name often used. The prosaic title West Linton is how it's best known today. In former generations, the name of the village was Linton Roderick. And the Roderick, according to legend, comes from the 6th century king of Strathclyde, who was Roderick or Ridderk. And the legend is that at some point during his reign, King Ridderk of the Strathclyde Britons had to make an expedition to the east. And just below the Pentland Hills, he defeated a pagan king who had been threatening his realm from the east of Scotland. And so the nearby village acquired the name of Linton Ridderk, or Linton Roderick. In you come. We just started to talk about Columba and his relationships with King Ridderk of the Britons of Strathclyde, and we're making a a link with West Linton in the Pentland Hills, which also has the name of Linton Roderick, a legendary name after a battle which may have been fought there by King Riddick of the Strathclyde Britons. Now, the pagan tribe that the king defeated, we don't know which one it was. They may have been other Britons from the east of Scotland, or they may have been Angles from the yet unconverted kingdom of Northumbria. We can't be certain, but such is the legend. Now, this Roderick, or Riddick of Linton Roderick, is the same Riddick who was king of Strathclyde during the years when Columba was abbot on Iona. And his reign also coincided with the reign of King Aidan of Strathclyde, of Dalriata, whom we talked of last week. And so Riddick becomes the fourth of the great kings of the Scottish mainland whom Columba had dealings with. There was Conall, who was king of Dalriata when Columba first arrived from Ireland in 563. There was Bridei, who was king of the Picts, whom Columba negotiated with, attempted to convert, had considerable dealings with. There was Aidan, who became king of Dalriata after Conall's death in 574. And we saw last week that Aidan was a strong, pugnacious, belligerent, self-confident monarch. And we saw that Columba had to exercise all his skills of statesmanship to ensure that Aidan's headstrong policies did not put Dalriata at risk as a state. Because in Columba's mind, if Dalriata as a state became a failed state, then the church on Iona and its whole mission was also placed at risk. And the fourth great king of Columba's era was King Riddick of the Strathclyde Britons. His fortress was a place we've mentioned before, the virtually impregnable Dumbarton Rock, or Alclute, in the Firth of Clyde. And like Dalriata, Strathclyde saw itself as being a Christian kingdom, albeit from a different Christian origin. The Christianity of Dalriata had its roots in the Irish Celtic tradition. The Christianity of Strathclyde had its beginnings either from the south of Scotland and Whithorn, or from Christian influences in the rest of the Lothians or Fife, both in the east. We can't be sure. It may have been a combination of these. And so Riddick was a Christian king. He was a strong king, not so bellicose or aggressive as Aidan, and the legendary battle at Linton Roderick shows that he was not averse to taking military action to defend his kingdom. However, whereas Aidan of Dalriata might embark on a military campaign for purely ambitious reasons, it seems that Riddick of Strathclyde was not of the same aggressive, expansionist stamp as his northern neighbour. And so, although both Strathclyde and Dalriata were deemed to be Christian kingdoms, although they both had that moniker, Riddick had to keep a wary eye on Aidan, knowing that because of Aidan's personality, because of his nature, that he might start campaigns against Strathclyde at any moment. You can see roughly the sort of boundary between Dalriata to the north and Strathclyde to the south, somewhere roughly there on the map. And indeed it was Riddick's fear of Aidan which brings Columba into his story, as we'll see. Now Riddick seems to have been a Christian by conviction. King Aidan of Dalriata was perhaps a Christian for political convenience, much more so. But Riddick was a believer by conviction. Or at least that seems to be what we can glean from the historical record, as much as we can interpret that. And so both kings nominally profess Christianity, but there appears to have been little harmony between the two. So Strathclyde and Dalriata shared a border, Strathclyde to the south, Dalriata to the north. And with an alpha male ruler like Aidan to the north, then Riddick of Strathclyde always had to be aware of what was happening up in these glens. He could not trust Aidan to leave Strathclyde alone. And Aidan seems to have been prone to sending raiding parties just over the international border, as it were, between the two kingdoms, and in a sense that activity replicated what Aidan was also doing around the edges of Pictland, where he was snapping away at the fringes, testing the borders to see what reaction there might be, to see what influence he might have. And so this brings us to the story which Adomnan records in his life of Columba. Adomnan tells this story in order to prove how Columba could foretell the future. That's Adomnan's main purpose. But in the telling of the story, Adomnan reveals what was happening in the power triangle of Columba, Aidan, and Riddick. And Adomnan tells us that the king of the Britons of Strathclyde, Riddick, was troubled. Aidan of Dalriata was threatening his northern border. He had a reputation for aggression, and therefore, despite Riddick having the strongest fortress in all Scotland, all Clute on the Clyde, he was anxious and he had sleepless nights. And so the king, Riddick, communicated with Columba. Now this was not a face-to-face meeting, but by secret envoy, and secrecy was essential. Aidan of Dalriata was not to know of this communication between Columba and a neighbouring monarch, and so total confidentiality was essential. And Riddick was anxious about what was in store for him. He wanted him to know from Columba whether he would be slaughtered by his enemies or not. And one enemy in particular he had in mind. And this need for reassurance probably arose after a particularly brutal raid on his borders by Aidan of Dalriata. Now, before giving a final answer, Columba sent one of his own trusted men to speak with the king. And when then this trusted servant returned, Columba quizzed him about King Riddick's state of mind. And the servant Ludby replied, he said, quote, "Why do you put questions about the unhappy man who cannot know at what hour he may be killed by his enemies?" End quote. And this reply, as recorded by Adomnan, is so revealing. It shows that Riddick was under tremendous emotional pressure and suffering tremendous anxiety. Now, the question that the king originally asked concerned whether he would die peacefully in his bed or not. But it seems that that explicit question may also have been a coded message to Columba. It may have been a plea to Columba to use his role as Aidan's trusted advisor to lean on Aidan and persuade him to stop these raids and stop these threats on the northern border of Strathclyde. Now, whatever lay behind the situation, Columba replied that Riddick should not worry. Columba states, according to Adomnan, he, the King Riddick, will never be delivered into his enemy's hands, but he will die at home on his own pillow. And in Adomnan's life of Columba, of course, this is cited as evidence of Columba's prophetic powers, and of course what Columba prophesied came to pass. Riddick outlived Aidan, dying some years after his neighbouring king. Now, Adomnan doesn't tell us whether Aidan attacked Riddick after Columba's reassurances, but if he did, then these came to nothing. Now, as we've seen, Adomnan doesn't tell us the story primarily in order to chronicle interstate relationships. His purpose is to exalt Columba The story occurs in Book 1 of the life of Columba, and the theme of Book 1 is concerning prophetic revelations. And so the main relevance of the story from a Domnan's viewpoint as author is in proving that Columba's predictions come true, rather than informing the reader about pure history. But in the telling of a story designed to bolster Columba's reputation as a prophet through whom God spoke, Domnan sheds light on these great issues of state. And he reveals how Columba is a pivotal figure in ensuring peace between Dalriata and Strathclyde. And it shows that a man of power, King Rideric, appeals to Columba in that dual role, both as a priest and as a political advisor to his own king. And what's noteworthy is that Domnan describes Rideric as a friend of the saint. So Columba in this story comes across not just as prophet in the religious sense, but he comes over as an advisor to kings, and he comes over as an international negotiator, keeping the peace between these two Christian kingdoms, these two kingdoms which profess Christian faith. Now, Columba's dealings with Rideric also brings us to the possible connection between Columba and Kentigern. Now, many weeks ago in our first lecture, we briefly noted Rideric in relation to St. Kentigern, or St. Mungo, as his other name goes. And when Rideric came to the Strathclyde throne, he brought Kentigern back from exile to continue the task of evangelism in Strathclyde that Kentigern had to abandon. That work had been brought to a halt by Rideric's pagan predecessor, and Kentigern had fled south to Cumbria and maybe even as far as to Wales. And we noted in that first lecture that Kentigern's own work may well have been built on the foundation of earlier Christian influences in the Strathclyde area, which may have come either from Whithorn in the south or from Fife and the Lothians in the east. And at any rate, Rideric's kingdom followed their monarch's faith. And so one question is that, were there any actual contacts between Columba and the kingdom of Strathclyde apart from the story that we cited? Did Columba and Kentigern ever meet? Jocelyn of Furness is a 12th century writer, quite a number of centuries after the times we're talking of. But Jocelyn of Furness wrote the standard life of Kentigern, which scholars believe are drawing on much earlier sources, on oral sources from an earlier time. And in his book, Jocelyn has a detailed description of Columba meeting Kentigern, who was Rideric's own spiritual advisor. And then Jocelyn's narrative of Columba and Kentigern, he has an elaborate narrative, tells of the two men approaching one another with huge processions coming behind them. It speaks of singing, of embraces, of eating together, of an exchange of pastoral staffs between the two Christian leaders. Now, none of this is mentioned by a Domnan, but it may be that Jocelyn is citing a tradition that had grown up in the intervening centuries, or there may be a kernel of truth somewhere in the actual data there. But certainly what's interesting is that in the earlier story, when the King Rideric is troubled about what is happening to his country, he wants reassurance from Columba rather than from Kentigern. He may have spoken to Kentigern as well. And it's because he approaches Columba when he has his own spiritual advisor that gives us the hint that in approaching Columba he's looking for more than just spiritual advice. He's looking for somebody who is at the right hand of this powerful king whom he actually fears away in the north, these Argyll men that he's afraid of. So how do we summarise Columba's dealings with great kings? Now last week and this week, we've argued that with all the kings that he dealt with, Columba had one unchanging aim. And that aim was the stability of Dalriata as a kingdom. And this was because the existence of the church based on Iona was dependent on the stability of the state of Dalriata. And Columba's thinking was very clear. Secure the kingdom and you secure the church's foothold in Scotland. And that was his guiding principle with Connaught, with Bridei, with Aidan, with Ridder, with all the monarchs. And Columba put all of his abilities, all his aristocratic connections, all his political acumen, and not least all his spiritual strength and prayer into that task. Now this meant, certainly in my view, that although like any Christian, Columba would prefer peace to war, he was not ideologically a pacifist. If war had to take place to protect God's kingdom of Dalriata, then war was justified. And Columba would pray in such circumstances not for peace per se, but for victory. Columba did not become a pacifist after the disaster of the Battle of Bridei in Ireland, which is infamously associated with it. In relation to that particular battle, he may have been over-enthusiastic, over-partisan, but after it, he was not a peace-at-any-cost man. And of course, this came out last week when we saw Columba praying for victory for Dalriata over the Meathi of Stirling. So if Columba was not a pacifist by ideology, what about his name? Columba means the dove. Columcille means the dove of the church. So how does he acquire that name? In our culture, of course, the dove is preeminently a symbol of peace. Doves are released sometimes at the start of the Olympic Games and other occasions to symbolize peace and fraternity between nations. But the dove is also a symbol of the Holy Spirit. And in Columba's culture, it was, I think, the symbolization of the Holy Spirit which was paramount in relation to Columba. And I think that Columba gained the name Columcille before he left Ireland. In fact, we know that. He gained that epithet in the years before the Battle of Bridei, which may have been the incident that led to him removing himself from Ireland. The dove symbolized the Holy Spirit. And Columba, it seems, was called the dove of the church because he was seen as a man filled with the mighty power of the Spirit, travelling energetically between the many churches that he helped to found. And so in Columba's case, dove does not in itself equal peace, but dove means the mighty power of the Spirit. It refers to the power and the energy that the Spirit brought. And it's that Spirit-led mission that he brought to Scotland. Now, in our culture, I think dove is so automatically associated with a symbol of peace that we maybe miss that earlier assignation of power as a symbol of the power of the Spirit. That's one to sort of think through and to reflect upon. By May of 597, Columba was an old man. Born 521, so 76, which in these days was quite an age. In that May, for example, when he went to see the monks at work in the fields over on the west side of Iona, he was no longer able to walk the distance, but was taken in a cart. Increasingly, he spoke about his coming death. Adomnan tells us that one Sunday when the Eucharist was being celebrated, he rallied, he gained strength, and this would mark the start of Columba's last week in this world. And Columba gives us a touching chronicle of these days and a very unusual last chapter in his life of Columba, his famous book. It's unusual in that it comprises one extended narrative written largely in the present tense. And it may be that in this final section, Adomnan is reproducing an Iona tradition in which the saga of Columba's death was handed on by word of mouth unchanged year by year. It was a custom in monastic communities for the monks to recite the story of their founder on a particular day of the year. Usually that day coincided with the day which was the anniversary of their death. And so it's probably the case that each year the Iona monks recited an account of the life and death of Columba. The words would hardly vary from year to year. They would remain the same. And it's more than probable that Adomnan's life of Columba reproduces that liturgical recitation. And so this simple narrative, what we call simple history, at the end of Adomnan's life of Columba, mirrors a simple history right at the very start, a very short section that tells us of Columba's birth in his early years. The rest of the life of Columba, as we talked about before, with his three great sections on prophecies, visions and mighty works, come in between and are of a quite different stamp, a different literary genre. And so the moving final chapter is as close as we can come in Adomnan to what we might call straightforward narrative. Adomnan tells us that what happened was this. On Iona, the Sabbath day of rest was still observed on a Saturday. The Celtic Church retained Saturday as the day of cessation from labour for much longer than the Continental Church did, which moved the Sabbath to Sunday at a much earlier stage. And this was the Irish Celtic pattern. Saturday was the Sabbath, Sunday was the Lord's Day, the day for worship. And so on the Saturday Sabbath, Columba and his servant Dermot went to bless a nearby barn. Every building on Iona had to be consecrated to God's glory and Christian service. And as they entered the barn, Columba noted with satisfaction 2 heaps of grain stored there, and he spoke to Dermot. He said, "I'm very glad for the monks of my community, knowing if I have to go away somewhere, you will have bread enough for a year." This, of course, saddened Dermot. He realised what was being alluded to, and Columba confided the secret to Dermot and said he was to say nothing until after his death. A despondent Dermot had to keep the news to himself for the next 24 hours, but Columba had more to do. Together they climbed a small hill near the monastery. Columba raised both his hands and he blessed the monastery. He prophesied in the times to come kings and peoples not only from Ireland but from foreign nations, not to mention saints of other churches, would all hold Iona in honour. Returning to the monastery, Columba then sat in his hut, his little wooden work hut, copying the Psalms. And Adomnan tells us he reached the verse in Psalm 34 that states, "They that seek the Lord shall not want for anything that is good." At this point, Columba said, "Here at the end of this page I must stop. Let Bethany write what follows." Bethany was one of Columba's original travelling companions that came from Ireland way back in 563, and at that point he was in charge of an Iona daughter monastery of Magluing on Tiree. Columba then went into the church for Saturday evening vespers. When the service was finished, he returned to his lodgings. He rested in his Spartan bed with its hard stone instead of a pillow. And then a few hours later, the bell rang out for the midnight office. Columba rose. He hurried as fast as he could for the church. And Adomnan says he went in ahead of the others. He knelt alone in prayer before the altar. And Dermot from the door had a glimpse of the whole building filled with an angelic light which shone round Columba's head. The light vanished as the monks entered. Dermot went forward. He spoke to Columba, but no reply came. He cradled Columba's head in his bosom, And Columba one more time opened his eyes and looked around him with a wonderful joy and gladness in his face, writes a Dominion. With a last gesture, he moved his hand, he blessed the monks, and then he died. Various people claimed to see and hear strange things the night Columba died, confirming to the Iona monks there was great joy in heaven when their abbot went to glory. Among Celtic Christians, the day of a believer's death was termed dis natalis, the date of one's birth into heaven. You would speak of the day of their birth rather than the day of their death. 3 days and 3 nights later, the funeral rites were carried out. Columba's body was wrapped in pure linen, buried at his chosen spot in a simple grave in the precincts of the monastery. His stone pillow became the grave marker. Storms meant that no one from off the island could attend Columba's burial. All was done solely by the community he had led and moulded by his spirituality and his strength of will. Interestingly, again, in the Celtic tradition for Columba, there was no clear marker, even despite his stone pillow, where the grave was. It never became a place of pilgrimage. It was an unknown place upon the island. So Columba dies, 3597. And having taken note of these things, what's Columba's legacy? A huge question. And we can only touch on one or two things here. I think the first thing is that Columba established a culture of prayer and scripture. And in a sense, we mustn't miss the wood for the trees. In several of our lectures, we've highlighted Columba as a statesman, as a politician, which he was to a great degree. We watched him deal with kings, with power figures. And in looking at that Columba, it could be so easy to miss the wood for the trees. At heart, Columba was a believer, a spiritual man, a man of prayer, a man of the scriptures. And more than one biographer has pointed out that throughout Adamnan's life of Columba, the most frequent references are to Columba reading the scriptures, copying the scriptures, teaching the scriptures. His very last day on earth is spent copying the sacred text and in prayer. And that's the core of his faith. We noted that the Amra Columcille, that the praise poem written within a year of his death, in that work Columba was celebrated as the man who interpreted the word of God and who taught that word to the people. So whatever other qualities Columba had, and he had many qualities, prayer and the scriptures occupy the centre of his work. And in Columba setting the tone for the whole Iona mission, then prayer and the scriptures would always be at the heart of Iona's work and its evangelism. Another aspect of Columba's spiritual legacy is the establishment of the huge family of monastic communities both in Ireland and Scotland that look to Iona as their head. Mary Herbert, an esteemed professor of Celtic studies in Ireland, is of the view that even by the time of Columba's death, Iona was the head of a group of monasteries in Ireland, in Scottish Dalriata, and all of these regarded Columba as an inspirational mentor. In each of these monasteries, the monastery was governed by its own abbot, but was also deferential to an overall jurisdiction of the abbot of Iona. So Columba may never have been given the title bishop, but to all intents and purposes he was one. In Marie Herbert's view, Columba set in place a robust system ensuring that his successors shared his familial and political affiliations, as well as his monastic vision. And during the next century, right to Adamnan's time, nearly all abbots of Iona came from Columba's kinsfolk. And in due course, more monasteries were added to the Iona Familia on both sides of the Irish Sea. The most spectacular expansion, of course, being into Northumbria in the 630s, leading to the establishment of Lindisfarne, originally staffed by Columban monks. I think also that Columba was an enabler for others. He was a prince of the powerful Uí Néill. He had the potential to become a king. In the first part of his life, he was a key player in the Irish church. When he arrived in Scotland, it was not simply his personal piety that made an impact, but his diplomatic abilities, his persuasive powers. And over the years, as we've seen, his interchanges with the power players of Pictland and Dalriata and Strathclyde and elsewhere were so important for the future of the church and the future of evangelism and spirituality. And if the ancient traditions are at all correct, then Columba created the conditions by which Celtic Christianity could thrive. By sheer stature, he opened doors. He negotiated permission for the Iona missionaries to do their work. My own field of studies used to be 19th century evangelical missionaries in South Africa. And one of the things that came across again and again was that what you had to do first was to negotiate permission. And negotiating permission with the power figure was essential before the ordinary people could be told the gospel, even if the power figure himself did not convert. And that completely reflects what Columba did. And in a sense, people often say, well, Columba didn't convert very many people himself. And that may be true, or it may not be. But he created the conditions in which the Iona mission could be tremendously effective. And so in this way, we can say that he assisted the evangelization of Pictland. You could never call him the apostle to the Picts, but he made it possible. So within a century of Columba's death, there was a large network of Iona-affiliated monasteries from the Murray Firth in the north to Northumbria in the south. Now, whether these monasteries were all original Iona creations, we're not certain. And certainly many modern scholars feel that some of them may have been founded by other missionaries to a great extent, like Medug and so on, and Iona sort of took them over. And that the original foundation story may have been lost. And that may be true. But certainly within 100 years it was the Iona mission that was supplying the energy behind all of that work. We can also move on to Columba's political legacy. And what's become abundantly clear in our lectures is that Columba was a prince as well as a preacher. He was a politician as well as a priest. And a major part of his legacy is in his influence on the political shape of the land that he came to in 563. To begin with, we've seen that he strengthened the kingdom of Dalriata. Columba's work alongside both King Conall and King Aidan contributed toward the Scots of Dalriata establishing Argyll in western Scotland as an independent kingdom. When Columba arrived in 563, he found both King Conall and his kingdom weak and vulnerable in the wake of recent defeats at the hands of the Picts. And there seems to be little doubt it was Columba, especially through his negotiations with Bridei of the Picts, that he massively helped to stabilise Dalriata's very existence. And there's also little doubt that in the early years of King Aidan's reign, Columba was influential at the Drumceat Convention, which drew a new map for Dalriata and that made Scottish Dalriata an independent kingdom in its own right. It was Columba's connections, Columba's influence that brought success there. And we also saw that Columba ensured that the question of succession would be clarified in Dalriata. This was not left to chance. Civil war, as individuals tussled for power, could destroy Dalriata, and Columba, in forcing King Aidan to settle the succession question, showed how this could be avoided and the existence of the kingdom could be secured. He also, and Sally Foster in her book on Picts, Gaels and Scots is very keen on this idea, he introduced a new view of kingship. kingship is now only valid if the nominee is approved by the church. Now with King Aidan, Columba simply recognised the fait accompli. But after King Aidan, the church was introduced into the power play so much that a king could never call himself king unless his position was homologated by the church. And this would continue eventually into the whole of Scotland. Another idea is that Columba contributed towards the notion of Scotland as a nation. Now, as already noted, because of Columba's presence and contact at the Convention of Drumceach, it was a success. Part of that success was establishing Dalriata in Scotland as a fully independent kingdom, and it was from that independent kingdom of Dalriata that the nation of Scotland would one day emerge. Now, John MacLeod, in his book Banner in the West, makes much of this. John MacLeod argues that Columba can be seen as the person responsible for giving substance to the concept of a nation of Scotland. Now, MacLeod focuses not on Drumceach, but on the Columban church network in Scotland. And John MacLeod, what he says is that the Columban church network spread all over Scotland, especially northern Scotland, that became the web that connected diverse parts of the land together. And in time that web aided the birth of the entity of Alba and then the entity of Scotland itself. In other words, people began to get into their minds the idea that this could all be one country. MacLeod argues that Columba establishes Christianity as a state religion, and in doing so bound it up with all the legitimacy of secular power. And in his view, it was the geographic extent of Columban Iona missions that created the notion of Scotland, the concept of Scotland being viewed as a whole. In MacLeod's eyes, the future unity of Scotland could be regarded as a Columban achievement. Now, that's an enormous claim for the Columban legacy. It may be a claim too much, but it certainly can point to the stature of Columban. And certainly, if all over the north you have people in little churches all praying for the same monarch, it gives tremendous legitimacy to that monarch and to the kingdom of which they are the monarch as well. What about the wider legacy? Did Columba's legacy spread beyond Ireland and Scotland? And here a resounding yes has to be uttered. We have, of course, the Lindisfarne mission. Columba died in 597, but by the year 635, less than 40 years later, King Oswald of Northumbria asked Iona to send a monk to help evangelize his kingdom and bring Christian faith to his nation. King Oswald had been in exile on Iona. He had been baptized by the early Celtic Church. When he went back to his kingdom, when he took power, as soon as he had enough power, he sent back to Iona saying, send someone here to bring the gospel to Northumbria. And eventually Aidan went, set up the base in Lindisfarne. Northumbria was evangelized and adopted Christianity. And until this fateful Synod of Whitby in 664, it was Columba's faith, Iona Christianity, Celtic faith, that made huge inroads into the pagan north of England, which of course includes the south of Scotland, the border. And so also the likes of the Melrose mission. The borders of Scotland were at that time part of Northumbria. It was from a daughter monastery in Melrose that the Scottish borders were evangelised, and from which great figures such as Eata, Boswell and Cuthbert did their work. All part of the Iona legacy, the Columba legacy. What also of Domnall, Columba's biographer? And several times in our lectures we warned against seeing Columba as a man of peace in the way that many are apt to view him. Like any Christian, Columba would prefer peace to war, but he was not a pacifist. He was not a 6th century Ban Ki-moon, Secretary General of the United Nations. He did not plead with his king to desist from war at all costs. Columba accepted its legitimacy if war would protect what he regarded as a Christian kingdom over against a pagan kingdom. However, Adomnan, Columba's biographer, was of a similar mind, but Adomnan sought to regulate warfare so as to minimize its cruelty. And so in 697, 100 years after Columba's death, Adomnan introduced a law which stipulated that in warfare, women, children, and the clergy were not to become targets for violence or take part in warfare. Now, Adomnan had the spiritual stature to persuade powerful leaders in both Ireland and Scotland to sign up to his law. It's one thing creating a law. It's only any good if people sign up to it. Now, Adomnan had the stature to do that. Why? Because he was Abbott of Iona. And why did the Abbott of Iona have that stature? Because of Columba. And because of Columba's legacy. And so the law, often called the Law of the Innocents, or the Cain Adomnan, Adomnan's law, was the first of what we might call a Geneva Convention, requiring civilized behaviour even during a time of strife. And we can call that an Iona success, a Columban success. Adomnan only had that stature because Iona had that reputation because of Columba himself. The demise of the Columban tradition. And yet neither the Irish Celtic Church in general nor the Columban Church in particular was destined to become the dominant church in Western Christendom. One factor is that the loosely structured Irish Celtic church system could never come out on top unless immensely able and strong individual figures such as Columba emerged in its monastic communities in every generation. The Roman continental church system was a system, highly organized, hierarchical. The Celtic church system was loose, individual, spontaneous, much more. And it required powerful individuals to maintain that position. Defeat to the Roman Church at the Synod of Whitby in 664 would be a watershed, a Rubicon, a reversal from which the ancient Celtic Church would never recover. And certainly during the 660s, 650s, the Church in Southern Ireland moved towards the Roman form of church life with regard to Easter in terms of church organisation, in terms of leadership. Adomnan himself became convinced of the Roman ways, but Iona refused to change. Northumbria moved to the Roman system, as we've seen in 664, moving away from its Celtic Irish base, perhaps because of the political ambitions of the king of Northumbria at that time as much as for any spiritual reason. And then eventually, in 710, King Nectan of the Picts, who at a time when the whole of Pictland was now part of the Celtic Church, he also decided that all the church within his kingdom should follow the Roman forms. And he said to any Iona monks that if they didn't like his decision, please leave my kingdom. And so in a sense we could say that in terms of being a structure, an organisation, a different entity, that the Irish Celtic Columban Church almost ceased within 200 years of Columba. But in terms, I think, of its spiritual impact, then it created an impact that lasted much longer, and perhaps even to the present day. Okay, thank you very much.